Hello there, and welcome to Gooner U, where there are no degrees because the learning never stops. I'm Dove, a TA here at Gooner U, and my friend Keith is our stalwart distinguished professor of Arsenal and football studies. This week featured our first Champions League match at home against PSV, as well as Premier League match number 6, also at home against Tottenham. Hello, Keith.
Hello, Dove. Are you feeling the whiplash from our performances this week?
Still, yes, a little bit. I did actually watch this Tottenham match live,
Hmm.
so it was. Yeah, it was. I went through everything at the same time as you did. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I say, I so did I. So did I.
Yep.
But we'll talk about that. We have
We
lots to
will.
talk
We
about.
have time to get there. The first thing I want to do is follow up. So we left some open questions as far as things I was wondering after watching the recap of Miami's match last week, and there were some kind of rules questions and how might MLS be doing things differently than Premier League that neither of us were sure about. I did some research and have some answers. So for one thing, no, MLS does not use Hawkeye technology. This is something they decided and put out a press release about a couple years ago, and it seems like nothing has changed in that time. Also, my understanding after reading a little bit more about this is now that Hawkeye is actually more complicated than I thought. It is a multi camera system, and it looks like the automated or semi-automated the line drawing, like the whole VAR offside technology, is possibly linked. It's possibly using similar variety of camera angles to try and determine whether the ball goes over the line. I had been imagining something built into the crossbar that just points
Hmm.
down and just shows ball crossed, ball didn't cross. You would think that that would be the only angle that you would need if it was like orthogonal to the goal line, but I guess it is more than that. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm only not surprised about that from the sense that when having seen the Hawkeye technology work. I mean, not that I watch tennis regularly, but every once in a while it passes on, or it's Wimbledon or something, and you'll see a play where they rule on it, and the way the graphic is sort of designed, it's clearly looking at things from a bunch of different angles and sort
oh,
of,
okay.
and then getting to the particular one. So it doesn't. I mean, I know there's been some talk, like the NFL in particular, American football has talked about, let's put a chip in the football so that when it crosses, like when it touches the goal line, and they've just never quite been able to get that to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Partly because they keep throwing the ball around, and what that's doing to the interior or the chip on the outside, I'm sure is part of
Sure.
that. But I suspect that idea about using the goal line like that, I'm sure that idea is out there, but I think the technology just it can't quite get that to work at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, so then the other open question pertained to the use of VAR in ruling on offside calls. So there was a case where it definitely appeared that there was an offside pass that led to a goal against Miami in that match. And I heard the commentators make mention of clear and obvious as a standard for even reviewing offside in that case. And it does look like this is a difference in MLS compared to Premier League, where they will review it. They will probably only draw lines if it looks like it's close enough that they need to, but they will review it no matter what. It seems like they only pull VAR into offside if they think there is a clear and obvious error. It seems like this is an intentional decision on MLS's part to keep the game moving, not to drag it out. And we see when it does definitely slow the game down in the Premier League when they do have VAR come in and review things. Oh my goodness, when the one VAR review during the Tottenham match was painful for that handball. I don't know how many times they needed to watch the ball bouncing off of that guy's hand before they decided that it was a handball. But yeah, so that does definitely slow the game down. And it seems like Howard Webb, you probably know better than I do what his actual title and position is within MLS, but this guy has made the decision that no, they want to keep it moving. So they only invoke VAR when there is a real need to. It's not a mandatory review all the time.
Yeah, I mean that, and I think some of that's probably technology related. The Premier League, of course, has substantially more money than MLS. Although MLS has more than enough, I think, to make this work if they really wanted to. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a philosophical element to that, and we've talked about this too, right? What's the point of replay? Is it to overturn clear and obvious errors, or to get the call specifically right? And MLS has sort of trended in another direction to it. Which is largely fine. Like as long as there's a sense that there's a clear standard, that's really what as a fan and I know players generally feel that way. As long as there's a clear standard, I can work with that.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of know what's coming, as opposed to it feels like it's something else.
Right.
Or
And this is
it feels
clearly,
variable.
yeah, and this is clearly a way that MLS avoids the toenail offsides. Like they're not going to be calling it if it's that close a call. They're not going to bring VAR in the first place. So that gets right around that. So yeah,
Yeah, and of all the people, Howard Webb Howard Webb is in charge of Pro, which in the U.S. is the Professional Referee Organization, which governs obviously the officials in
sure.
MLS. It's essentially, and I'm sure there's some details I'm wrong about this. Essentially, the equivalent of the PGMOL in England. I mean, Howard Webb was a longtime official in the Premier League in England.
Ah,
So he's actually a pretty well regarded official overall. And I'm trying to remember, he may have actually, was he the one who, I'm looking this up. He actually refereed the World Cup final in 2010. So he's a very well regarded official, and
yeah.
is also apparently, actually, now, because I've looked this all up now, that is the first person to referee both the World Cup final and the Champions League final in the same year. He did
Huh.
the Champions League final in 2010, both of them
Huh.
in 2010. So
Interesting. Is he English?
yes, Howard Webb is from Rotherham, so he is in Yorkshire.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the first one didn't really help me so much.
Yeah,
I was gonna say Netherlands.
well,
All
that's
right.
Rotterdam.
Yeah, that's close. So you passed along an interesting piece of news for the other football to go over. What's that coming up next weekend?
Well, so we have there's all kinds of crossover here. So the NFL is doing its European games. The Jacksonville Jaguars and the Atlanta Falcons will be playing at 9:30 Eastern on Sunday morning, this Sunday, October 1st. Which ESPN will be simulcasting with what they call the Toy Story game. So presumably very similar to, was it the Big City Greens and some of those other
Right.
games we talked, a virtual, they're calling it, this is their word, a virtual recreation of the game being played in the Toy Story universe. Now, what that actually looks like in person, I have no idea. Um, they,
I will be
yeah,
reporting. I
yeah.
have my son has registered interest. He and I both share a love of Toy Story. Like with the Big City Greens hockey game, this will be the first football game he has ever watched. So it's doing the
Yes,
job.
unfortunately, whereas his entryway into soccer has been with Arsenal and then Leo Messi, his entryway into the NFL is going to be the Atlanta Falcons and the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I apologize for that. I shouldn't say that. The Jaguars, they both have some interesting players, but anyway, like the Jaguars might not be bad, but anyway, yeah. So they will be. That will be. That'll be interesting to see, and they're continuing to do that kind of stuff in part because um, it's sort of like you're bringing your son in. It's a way to sort of draw
Mhm.
kids in. They're not going to watch an NFL game with all of its typical accoutrements, but you stick it in something that they do enjoy and recognize, gets them interested and involved in the game. Apparently, there are also says they're going to have some how-to videos for kids,
Mhm.
so it's going to be targeted towards a children's audience. Which, if you are, not that you're entirely new to football and don't understand the sport, but I'm sure you might pick up a few things in there as well.
Sure.
Um, maybe, I don't know. We'll see.
I'm more familiar with football than with hockey.
Right.
Probably about equally familiar to how I was with soccer before, starting this Arsenal journey with you. Probably comparable. I'd watched more football. I mean, I had
Yeah.
seen some football games
This
before.
is this is the this in spite of the name, this is the one where they use their hands.
Yeah, well, it's actually funny. So before we were even talking about the Sunday Fun Day Toy Story game, my son had asked me, why do they call it football if you don't use your feet? And I was like, that's a good question. And we had a long car ride coming up, and I was planning on talking about it, and I neglected to until we were sitting down and eating, and I actually looked it up. And I think
Mhm.
the story that I got came from, it was the the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I think, had an article that explained how basically American football has its history in soccer and rugby,
Mm-hmm.
and they were all called football. Like they were both called football at one point until they kind of differentiate between the association football and the rugby football, and association football dropped the association, and rugby football dropped the football, and American football is like, well, this is our football, and it didn't have forward passing initially. And then they added it, and it just kind of became part of the game. And it was we just call it football because.
Yeah. That's essentially that's how I understand it. For a while, it was called gridiron football because the field used to have a grid laid over it. Now it's just just a bunch of parallel lines. But
Huh. So yeah. As with last week, I did not actually watch the Miami game. It came on while I was doing other stuff last night. I haven't watched the highlights yet either. But also in conversation with my son, he asked, well, I can't say he fully asked this question, but it kind of came up in conversation. It was kind of a question that I asked myself, but we were talking about how Arsenal has never been relegated. We were talking about, okay, I know how we got in this conversation. We were in New York, further north than where I live, and there's a turnoff to Leeds. And I was like, oh,
okay.
Leeds. And he was laughing at Leeds. I don't know what made him laugh at it, but as I was explaining, the reason I was laughing was because, Leeds, that's in England. They have a football club that just got relegated last year. And so we were talking about relegation, and I was explaining how Arsenal has never, because he asked, has Arsenal been relegated? And I said, no, Arsenal is one of the few teams, if not, correct me, was it the only team or one of the few teams that's never been relegated?
They're the only team that's never been relegated from the top division
Right.
ever. They're one of a handful that's never been relegated from the Premier League, but the Premier League
Okay.
only goes back to like 1991,
Right.
92.
Right.
So
Right. Okay. So kind of both. So
yes, it depends on how you're asking the question, but the answer to both is yes.
yeah. So then he asked me, has Miami ever been relegated? He's still kind of fuzzy on Miami's a different league, those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things. And I knew the answer is no, clearly they've only been around 2 years. Like
Mm-hmm.
whatever the rules are in MLS, no, they haven't been. But there were some things when I wanted to add more detail, there were some things that I didn't know enough to answer. So does MLS have relegation is kind of the first question. Do teams move between whatever it's called, we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, the MLS championship or whatever. I
Mm-hmm.
know they adopted the name, but so do teams move between those two leagues is the first question.
No. That's there's the reason Miami has never been relegated is no one is ever relegated. So
Right.
MLS is what they call a closed system. It runs on the same rules, the same structure as any other major American sports league, what they call the franchise model. Um, Picture this, and this is how, to me, as a metaphor makes sense. I live in Houston. The MLS team here is the Houston Dynamo. The Dynamo do not compete financially against FC Dallas or Miami or New York City or any of those other teams. The Houston Dynamo compete financially against the Houston Astros, the Houston Rockets, they compete against the other teams in this particular market. So in a lot of ways, they work a lot like a fast food restaurant.
Hmm.
So the NFL is McDonald's. It's the biggest one. It has franchises everywhere.
Right.
The next one, Major League Baseball, is, I don't know, Burger King. I'm just naming names at this point.
Sure.
One of them's Chick-fil-A, one of them's Taco Bell. But the point is, you're talking about your local franchise, and the question is, from an American consumer's perspective, is where do I spend my entertainment dollars?
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, that's a little different because of the sort of the hold that soccer has, particularly in England, but on the continent too. In a lot of respects, those clubs are competing against one another as well, and they're independent entities. The leagues are formulated separately to sort of hold them together, whereas in the American League, the teams do not exist independent of the league.
Right.
So, in that sense, there is no relegation. In fact, technically, the USL, who runs the second, third, and fourth divisions, is an entirely separate organization. There is no promotion and relegation. Now, some of what you'll see is over the last decade plus, there's been a lot of expansion in MLS. A lot of what it's been, some of it has been teams that are organizations or ownership groups that are in USL are then sort of moving their club. They're not moving the club, but they're applying for membership into the MLS, they get it, and then there's a modification of the club when they move in. So, just I'm now going to rattle off a list of some of them I'm seeing that I know are some of these moving up teams. I think Minnesota was one, Orlando was one, Cincinnati, Nashville. Even Miami was a different group, but still, this idea that you have these teams, that the organization doesn't transfer its records or anything in, but a lot of them will sort of start with some of the leftover players from when they were in the USL. Some of them bring the same coach up, but they're moving into new stadiums. They'll rebrand, they'll change the name. So there's a lot of transition that goes in. They're technically, in a business sense, different entities.
Okay. So I guess the short answer is it basically works like all the other American leagues, pretty much, like
Yeah,
at a high
it just
level.
doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen.
Yep.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so when you join MLS, the expansion, it's again like joining another league. The league decides they want to expand. Ownership groups apply based on their cities and their market, and if they're accepted, you have to pay a massive expansion fee. Um, and then within a year or two, or however long they decide the timetable is, you're in the league. And they've
Mm-hmm.
all of them have expanded relatively recently. I think MLS keeps expanding. They're going to add St. Louis is brand new this year,
Hmm.
and then San Diego will be the 30th team, which I just saw is in 2025. So
Hmm.
next year nothing new, and 25 we'll add San Diego. The NHL expanded recently with Vegas in the last like 6 years ago, and then Seattle just finished their second season. So you see that in other leagues as well. Baseball is apparently talking about expansion, but it's the same thing. You apply and are sort of let in, and then they restructure the league based
Hmm.
around that.
Yeah, that's. I can see that. I can see how it fits in the fast food model that you laid out. That makes sense. Since you mentioned St. Louis being a new team, that actually dovetails with a question that I've had for a few weeks now. I'd seen in the Apple TV app something about SKC, which I think is Kansas City's, like soccer or Kansas City or something.
Sporting Kansas City.
Okay. So is SKC versus STL St. Louis, new rivals rumble. This is a game on September 2nd. How how was this rivalry manufactured? Like, what are on what grounds does this rivalry stand? Like, we've talked about like Arsenal and Tottenham, like we'll be talking about later, right? We talked last season about, well, Tottenham was in North London from the beginning. Arsenal kind of moved into their territory in North London. That makes perfect sense as the beginnings of a rivalry. I can totally see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you've got these two new soccer teams formed in the last year, right? Like one of them. How do they become
Yeah.
rivals with each other? What happens?
I mean, all rivalries really start from two particular things. One is proximity. That is like Arsenal and Tottenham. They're essentially the same neighborhood. They're close to each other. Arsenal, Chelsea, both being in London. There's a regional proximity. So I mean, a lot of like college rivalries are like this, or the Yankees and the Red Sox, Ohio State, Michigan. The sense that you've got two teams that are close together, and so there's a certain amount of geographic. The fight for geographic supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
The other rivalry is formed as a result of competition. Typically, you have two teams competing against each other, and these rivalries tend to ebb and flow over time. Sometimes they're really big because both the teams are really good, and then when one or both of them drops off, no one cares as much anymore. And hey, remember like 10 years ago, we were really big rivals with that. How big those games were. Um, an example of that one would Arsenal Manchester United. I mean, yes, it's a big game, and we've sort of talked about the emotions that come with it. But I mean, when those two, 15, 20 years ago were on top of their games were for the league title. That was a massive game in terms of the context of the league. And people you'll hear today, people talk about how it's kind of lost its luster. Is it getting it back? And I mean, probably not unless the two of them actually start to, take those two prime positions in the league. And frankly, as long as Manchester City keeps spending money the way they do, no one will do that. But
Mm-hmm.
so in this case, Sporting, Kansas City and St. Louis is entirely geographically based. They are on opposite sides of the state of Missouri, or in the case of Kansas City, they're technically in Kansas, but still Kansas City and St. Louis have
Mm-hmm.
a longstanding rivalry sports rivalry. I really at this point it's just the Cardinals and the Royals for baseball. I don't think they have. I don't think they actually share any other, because St. Louis doesn't have an NFL team. I don't think they share any other sports. But yeah, so there's something of a long-standing rivalry between the cities, and the clubs there are picking up on that. Much like New York, both Red Bulls and New York City have their regional rivals each other, but they also have rivalries with New England and with Philadelphia. Because New York, the city, has rivalries with Boston and Philadelphia. So they're, in a lot of ways, they're kind of drafting off of that.
Sure. That makes sense.
And you'll see that as well. My favorite one though is in the state of Ohio. Cincinnati and Columbus have a rivalry, which, I mean, Cincinnati's only been around like 5 or 6 years. Columbus is an old MLS club. It's old MLS club, so it's like not even 30 yet. But the rivalry is named after a billboard sign that I have seen on the interstate highway that runs between Cincinnati and Columbus. Was put up by someone who was trying to get people's attention for spiritual matters, and so it's a giant billboard that just says "Hell is real." And so the nickname, the fan bases have nicknamed their rivalry "Hell is Real," which I like. I appreciate. Still, though, the cleverest one, of course, being the two Los Angeles teams, LAFC and the LA Galaxy. Their rivalry is nicknamed El Trafico.
That makes sense.
Which is just delightful.
So the Hell is Real billboard was about the game, or it was just unrelated and people passed it on the way to the match?
No, it's a billboard. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the state of Ohio.
Not
I know
much.
You're from the Chicago area, so you know maybe a little bit.
Yeah,
I mean, Ohio,
much.
Outside of the major cities, Ohio is pretty rural, and these are blunt instruments, but if we think in the sort of pseudo-traditional red-blue divide, the cities are going to be relatively blue, the rural area is going to be relatively red, particularly a very religious form of that kind of conservatism. And so you will see giant billboards where it's a series of billboards where, hell is real, where will you go when you die, call this number for a Bible, that kind of, and so
gotcha.
But it is a pretty stark thing to just, especially when you're in Ohio, which, let's be honest, is fairly flat. He said from Texas, which is also fairly flat, but you can see it from quite a distance off, and it's just, they're very stark. Hell is real. Well, okay then. So
gotcha. Yeah, mostly I've passed through Ohio and don't recall that billboard, but I will point out as a PSA to any listeners who happen to plan on ever driving through Ohio, watch your speed. I think that's speeding tickets sustain the economy of Ohio. I have a feeling, or at least the government there.
I have never. I've driven through it a bunch of times. I've never actually been pulled over on it. But
yeah.
I will. There's
they're out there, and they know so many people pass through, and they're not going to come back to fight the ticket. Like, it's that
sort of thing. I will say though, as someone who has been to Ohio and in several different places, I have an affinity for the state of Ohio. I appreciate it for what it is, and I actually like Cleveland. I've enjoyed my times visiting Cleveland. Columbus, not so much, but that probably has more to do with the Ohio State University. But that's for a different podcast. So
yeah, I think we've put it off long enough. I think we should get to our main topic. The first of which is going to be the PSV match from whatever it was Wednesday last week. So September 20th, we really trounced them 4-0. This was our re-entry into a Champions League. It was quite a statement of intent there.
Did you have fun? Did you enjoy the Champions League night?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was night for me because I watched the replay later on in the day, completely unspoiled. I was able to experience it in all its glory as if it were live for me, like I typically end up doing.
Yeah, it was fun. I think part of it is, it was fun in particular because we saw a version of Arsenal that we haven't seen really this season. We haven't really seen probably since not even the end of last season. Excuse me, probably further back even last season. PSV wanted to play. They wanted to be open. They wanted to attack, and so did we. Is really the best way to say it.
They learned their lesson.
I don't think it's so much a lesson sense. I mean, the Netherlands is a country that by and large plays more open and attacking soccer. So there were, in a sense, they were probably, and obviously they know us a little bit. We played them last year in the Europa League. There's some familiarity there, but I think they came in saying, this is who we are, this is how we play, this is how we're going to play. As opposed to in England, there's a greater acceptance of that park the bus, counterattack negative style, especially when you're like many of the teams we play tactically or technically inferior and sort of need to play that way. And PSV, it was having a very good season, and the Netherlands is not going to play that way.
Right.
Which was nice because it gave us that kind of open space that we've been wanting, and we made the most of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's the lesson I was talking about. Is like that style, unless you are stronger than us. Like we've seen Manchester City do that to us, right? Like we
Mm-hmm.
saw that last year. But yeah, like they know now that hopefully we'll see a different strategy from them, which will keep us on our toes and keep it interesting. But
Yeah, but we did what we wanted to do with it, and it was a lot of fun. And I mean, I actually didn't see the whole game. I only was able to watch portions of the first half. I turned it on; it was already 1-0, so that was exciting. I saw 2 goals, and then I had to log off again. And then by the time I was back, the game was over. So,
yeah,
but yeah, it was. It's nice. It feels like sort of a like you're dipping your toes in the water because it's PSV. We literally just played them in the Europa League, but
right. It's
still the
funny that
sense
way.
of
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, as we were playing, Manchester United was playing Bayern Munich. I mean,
yeah,
that's where we are is in that competition. And again, for Arsenal fans of a certain age who are more than 5 years, this is where Arsenal is supposed to be.
right.
This is the kind of club we envision ourselves being, who plays in this competition, who thinks we can go deep in this competition, which I think we can. Depending on how the draw shakes out. Yeah, it was sort of a sense of being back where we belong, which is it really sort of colors a lot of that.
Sure. Yeah. A few initial remarks. So David Raya maintained his position as our de facto number one in this match
Mm-hmm.
and against Tottenham. The general, or I guess the head coach, I was going to say general manager. They don't use that term in
Yeah.
soccer, do they?
Well, they don't use head coach either. He's the manager.
He's the
So
manager. Okay. Thank
yeah.
you. Their manager Peter Bosch, he does look a lot like Pep Guardiola as you glance at him. I think he maybe wears glasses and Pep doesn't, but the bald head and facial hair, it was a
Oh,
little bit disorienting a couple
so
times.
you were talking about PSV Bosch. I actually, yes, he is actually a head coach. They are technically different titles, head coach and
Okay,
manager. Arteta is a manager, but it means there's something. This was a whole thing, like because Arteta, when he took over, was the coach, and then a few months later they elevated that to manager, and that speaks to the fact he has a wider purview within the club than just coaching the team. But actually, as I was just looking, Bosch is actually the head coach at PSV.
okay.
Um,
And a different person is their manager. They don't have
no,
a
they don't
manager
have they
right
don't
now.
have a manager. I mean, well, they do have a team manager, but I suspect that's I don't know what position they hold. I mean, once you get into Europe, the organizational structures are very different. Um,
Yeah,
and so I don't quite know all of that. I mean, and they are they're a very different kind of club. I mean, in PSV, I mean, their name, Philips Sport Vereniging, the Philips Sports Association. It started as a club for workers at Philips, the
right,
electronics company. So they haven't quite disconnected from that entirely. Um, yeah, the organizational structure there is going to be very different than what you would see even in England, or even forget even what the U.S. looks like.
right. Yeah, so the next thing I noticed that was kind of interesting, and I don't recall this. I would have thought that this would have been the same way in the Europa League, but I don't recall, so it might not have been. But it seems like the Champions League has their slate of sponsors of the league, and they had a graphic that they would show at the halftime break and before the match and probably after the match. They had like all their logos, and those were the sponsors on the sideboard ads during the match, which
Mm-hmm.
was really interesting. I'm used to seeing a certain handful of sponsors that we see for Arsenal matches. A lot of it is Arsenal advertising its own kits and stuff like that, and then the Adidas ads for their
Mm-hmm.
shoes, whatever they're trying to promote and stuff, right? Their cleats. But yeah, these were like separate, different ads for like non-English European companies. It was kind of weird knowing that we were at the Emirates, but seeing these foreign to England ads was kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean that's the Champions League. That's partly where its money comes from, of course, is
Sure.
all the advertising. I mean, Heineken's a big one, and there's a couple of. I mean, they're companies you probably all recognize. As you see them, you know them as businesses or recognize them even in
Some,
the
yeah.
U.S. Um, but yeah, I mean, the Champions League is ruthless about that kind of. Europe is, UEFA is pretty ruthless about that kind of thing. And I think we talked about this a little bit last year. Even then, even the stadium in European competition, at least this, I'm pretty sure this is still the case. It definitely used to be. Um, we do not play at the Emirates Stadium. We play at Arsenal Stadium
Hmm.
because they won't use the name Emirates since Emirates is
Hmm.
not a sponsor of the Champions League or every European competition. So
Interesting.
they are pretty ruthless about that. But there is that sense of sameness, right? That the ads you see at a Champions League game are the same whether it's in London or in
Right.
Munich or Madrid or anywhere. They're all the same ads because you're watching a Champions League match. The
Right.
competition is the brand as much as any of the individual clubs.
Yeah. Interesting. That rule about the stadium name that carries across any name of a stadium that has a company title that isn't a sponsor of the Champions League. They strip that away.
I believe so, yes. I mean, I say they strip it away. What it means is during the broadcast, you'll see it
Right.
listed as Arsenal Stadium,
Right.
or the announcers will say, we're at the Arsenal Stadium in London, as opposed to when
Right.
watching the Premier League, we're at the Emirates Stadium.
Right. The only way you're getting your company's name mentioned during a Champions League broadcast is "F you, pay me," like to paraphrase
Yeah,
Goodfellas.
yeah, pretty much. I mean, and some of them have their own ads. The names are stuck elsewhere. But there are ways around it, so to speak. But you see, a lot of stuff is also covered up by
Hmm.
Champions League, paraphernalia or other Champions League identifiers, because
Yeah.
I mean, there's a real benefit to having your name associated with that competition.
Sure.
The NFL does this sort of the same way. Is pretty ruthless about what gets advertised or what gets named or shown during an NFL game. Especially, I mean, most famously, they really go nuts on the Super Bowl.
Sure.
So you'll hear even advertisements, talking about the big game, because if they say Super Bowl, the lawyers are going to be all over them, immediately all over them. So,
Right.
um, yeah,
I never
the
realized that
business,
was the reason for that. Yeah.
yeah, the business side of sports, as it were. My favorite one actually is you'll see bars or other places have not a Super Bowl party, but a superb owl party. That if you shift the letter one over,
That's a good one. So let's go into some of the finer details of the match. I mean, it was just, I mean, the entire first half was just, I think the phrase we used last season was champagne football. It was just like everything was falling into place. They
mm-hmm.
presented no challenge. It was really, really something to watch.
Yeah, I mean, we were imperious, we were dominant, we were everything you'd want to be. Yeah, I mean the goals. Saka scores the first year Champions League goal since Theo Walcott in 2016. I remember Theo Walcott. I'm sure it doesn't mean anything to you, but it was just great to see. They did well. Jesus got on the scoreboard. I mean, things went so well that by the time but you got to later in the second half, and they were able to pull Saka and Jesus and some of the key players off the field and get them some
Mm-hmm.
rest because the game was over. And
Yeah.
not that we're counting points yet in the group necessarily, but we beat up PSV. Sevilla and Lens drew 1-1, so we're
Hmm.
on top of the group, and we are well positioned at least early on. We still have to play Sevilla twice. We still have to go to PSV. There's still a lot to be played for, but
Right.
the goal is to win the group, which will give you theoretically an easier draw come the round of 16. But we're a long way
Right.
from that. But still, it's nice to start out with a really good result, +4 on goal difference. It
Yeah.
was just great. Apparently, though, it was pouring. You saw in the video, it was pouring rain the whole night, and
Mm-hmm.
people were talking about how waterlogged it was. But yeah, to play like that in that weather too was nice. It was very nice.
I actually participated in a waterlogged game on Saturday morning.
Hmm.
Definitely not as fun being the coach during a watery soccer game as it is being a player.
Yeah, with the player, I mean, anytime you're in one of those, it reaches that point where you're just soaked and it doesn't matter any.
Oh
Like you
yeah,
realize
yeah.
you're never getting dry, so who cares?
I definitely reached that point. People were like offering me umbrellas, and I was like, "Yeah, why? It's
Yeah.
fine." The biggest problem is I'm standing there with my clipboard trying to manage like line changes and stuff, and the
Hmm.
paper is so saturated my pen won't work anymore. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, whatever.
Yeah, we're you know what? Just you come on. Somebody comes on. Someone comes
Yeah,
off. We'll figure it out.
that only happened toward the end, so it was fine. I only had to do like one kind of impromptu ad hoc change, but yeah. The so I was watching this later on at night, and it was actually kind of funny for me. This was the first time for the last like maybe 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes of the match, I actually fell asleep. Like I generally am not getting enough sleep, and when I'm watching like a movie or something, especially if I've just eaten or something, I'm tending to not off these days. I'm going through a period like that. Never for an Arsenal match, right? Like I will watch it begin and end, and it's holding my attention, but it's just we were 4-0 and there was no threat, and I think my mind just knew it could let go.
Yep. It's a good feeling. I'll tell you, it's a
Yeah.
good feeling.
Yeah. So I woke up momentarily and confirmed, oh, yeah. Okay. No, we did win. Okay.
Can
But
confirm.
yeah. So a couple other notes from the match. So for one thing, so this was a replay I was watching on Paramount Plus. First of all, I'm hoping this trend continues that the replay was available in a timely manner. I know some of our Europa League matches, when I went to watch a replay of that after I got home from work or something, it wouldn't get posted until like way later on or the next day even. And I'm hoping that the Champions League gets more of their resources to keep that timely.
Mm.
It was also funny. I don't know if it's going to stay this way or maybe it'll only be this way through the group stage or something, but there was no halftime show. So it's kind of funny watching the replay. I'm in the habit of, okay, half is called. I usually skip forward 10 minutes because that's enough that it'll have like the 5 minute halftime show and 5 minutes of ads. And then the game comes back roughly around then. But I skipped
Yeah.
forward 10 minutes and I was like 10 minutes into the second half. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There's nothing. It goes straight from end of
Yeah.
first half to beginning of second half.
I mean, I have a suspicion there because with the Champions League, I think they do a lot more to line the games up into windows so that several games are happening simultaneously, which means you get a single halftime show. A
Ah,
lot like watching the NFL, you get a single halftime show that tries to talk about everything. And so it's really, and I've gotten this impression, I don't know this is exactly how they do it, but like with the NFL games, you're actually only getting the halftime show is only like they're all in the air for like 4 or 5 minutes. Like they really aren't doing
right.
very much, and mostly it's just like they're trying to recap 4 games at once. And so you usually just go around the table. Okay, what's the most interesting thing you've seen in the first half today? And they don't mean of your game; they mean of the 7 games that we're showing right now. What's the
Yeah.
most like what's something that stood out to you? And so you'll sit in the halftime show, and they'll never mention your game or your team at all. Which United and Bayern apparently played a pretty wild one. So I assume they may have talked more about that. I mean, Arsenal looked really good against PSV.
Right. What else are you
That's
going to
it. I
say?
don't know what else to
Yeah.
say about the first half. If you're in that space where you're trying to truncate and try and talk about a bunch of different things. So,
Sure.
but I don't know. I didn't see the halftime show either, so I can't say really how they approach that.
Yeah. Also, I don't know who's responsible for such things, but somebody needs to update the Super Mick Arteta chant because Tierney's not on the team anymore, and we're not on our way to the Champions League. This is being chanted while we were in a Champions
Yeah.
League match.
Well, I've heard that. I've heard some. Well, apparently last year there was a real big thing about the line about on their way to Champions League. During the course of last season, some people switched it to say Arsenal on their way to win the league, talking about where we were last
Ah,
season. Or there was also Arsenal going back to Champions League, or
yeah.
so it's probable, or Arsenal going to win the Champions League. There were all of those. Like there's slight modifications made, but since there's no overarching authority to any of this stuff,
Right.
there are a lot of these versions flown around. I've heard that we've got Gabby in the back and Gabby in attack, so as
Oh,
opposed to
okay.
Tierney.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know what the official version is right now. That's
Yeah.
basically what I mean by all of that.
um. Yeah. One. Oh, actually, no, never mind. That was a point I was going to bring up from the Tottenham match, not from PSV. So, is there anything else that you want to talk about before we take our midway break?
No, just it's good to be back. It's good to be
Yeah.
back.
Well, it's also good to record podcasts with Zencaster like we do. So we use it every week. I sign in, I open up the session, Keith joins. A couple minutes later, we hit the record button and we get talking, and then Zencaster takes care of everything else. We do most of our video post production. It's responsible. Typically, when it's just me and Keith, it'll do a side by side split, is how I have it configured. But it's really nice. It came in super handy when we had Mike on last week, and we did their Zen view where it has one big person who's speaking and everybody else is in a little picture-in-picture window, and it manages all that for you, and it rotates, whoever's talking versus in the bottom. Hopefully, if we have any other guests on in the future, we'll be able to get some additional video, because that was not Zencaster. That was just our guest co-host not having a video feed available. So but it looked great, and we're really thankful to be able to have access to a tool like that makes things so super easy. I spend so little time on the video. I spend way more time editing audio after the fact for the audio podcast feed. Because Zencaster is super easy to record. You log in using your browser and start recording a high quality podcast right away. Record studio quality sound and up to 4K video with your guests. You can feel a sense of zen knowing Zencaster's multi-layered backups ensure you always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable, as very often happens. If you have thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, or at least you thought you did, those days are over. With Zencaster's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and then distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations. You can also use their new iPhone app to be able to record while you're on the go. So if this sounds good to you, if you want to get your passion project kicked off, start your own show, go to zencaster.com/pricing, use our code Gooner, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you can't remember that there's no U in Gooner, we do offer a link in our show notes or our show description. You can click on that link, and it's the same as entering the code, so nothing to remember, just go there. I want you to have the same easy experience as we do for all of our podcasting and content needs. It's time for you to share your story. So thanks again to Zencaster. Tottenham. So this was an interesting match. I clearly wish it had gone better. I clearly wish that we ended it with a better record than Tottenham instead of remaining even in points with them.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different interesting things to say about this one. I think the first one is sort of the big news coming out when the lineup came out. Obviously, we saw Raya in net again, which he's the number one keeper now.
Yeah.
Like that just kind of has just happened. And I mean, I'm not super surprised that it's happened, but I thought, when Ramsdale replaced Leno, you almost saw it coming. The team had been awful for those first three games. It wasn't Leno's fault. They were getting blown out, but it felt like a good moment to try something different, and Ramsdale was very different. I didn't think I thought Ramsdale was fine during those first few games. Right. Maybe I could have nitpicked some things here and there, but I thought he was fine overall. And then but then again, Raya, statistically, we talked about last year, was a better goalkeeper. And presumably he is doing the same thing in training, and now he's the man. He wears the shirt. He's the number one.
Yeah.
I mean, I presume we'll see Ramsdale next week, in this coming week, in the Carabao Cup, and maybe Ramsdale will be more of a cup keeper. But yeah, Raya's the number one. So that's just interesting how quickly that seems to have taken place. Because if you're starting the Champions League and the North London Derby in the same week, you're the number one. There's no
right.
Yeah, that's the number one keeper.
Right. Yeah. A week ago, we weren't really sure. There was one game, or maybe at that point, two games that we'd seen. It was like, we'll see. Maybe Ramsdale will be here in the Champions League. Yeah. No, it's Raya. I mean, one thing I'll say, and this was more evident to me during the PSV match than during the Tottenham match, but with what, I forget if it was you or Mike, but one of you had pointed out about catching the crosses. Mm-hmm. And after you pointed out, I was like, oh yeah, I do kind of remember that once. Well, paying attention to it fully this week, that is a superpower. Absolutely. Watching him do that, I saw it at least a couple times in the PSV match where, holy cow, this is one of the ways that it is easiest to score against us, as I've seen over the last year or so, where you just get that ball in the air near the goal. All it takes is somebody just catching it the right way, and there's little you can do to defend against that. Well, this is how you defend against it. You grab it before anyone else's
Exactly.
head can get on it. And he just gets himself there. I don't know. I basically watching him play, I wonder why everyone doesn't play this way. Why doesn't every keeper do this? This seems like how it
Yeah.
should be done.
I mean, some of it's, I think a lot of it's just they talk about players of that at level. You hear analysis that it's about who really wants it. Like, I mean, well, they all kind of want it. They're all super competitive individuals, but like, there's something about the desire to do it, but also a timing. Like, there's a lot of timing that goes into get it, because if you miss that jump, well, you're in big trouble. The
Well,
ball's
right,
loose in the
yeah,
box and you're way out of position. So
right.
there's a timing element too, and having the confidence that yes, I am going to go up. I've measured this ball. I'm going to go up and get it. You're throwing yourself into a mix where there are people throwing their bodies at other bodies. They're trying to get their head on the ball. So you'll see some of that too, and it creates a difficult environment to go up and jump and do that. Um, so I think that's part of it. But yeah, I mean, he is really good, and he has been good. And Ramsdale wasn't bad at that, but you can see Raya has been very assertive about that and has done a very good job with it overall.
Yeah.
Um,
He just closes off an entire avenue of scoring. If I'm
mhm.
a manager going into a match against Arsenal, I'm going to be telling my players, don't even try scoring that way. Find other ways to approach the goal because it's just a dead end.
Yeah.
So
But
yeah,
it is
that's
such.
good to see.
But as you point out, it is a sort of an old school way of thinking that you go down the wing and throw the ball in on a cross. But I mean, it's kind of old school and considered somewhat Neanderthalish because how non tactical it is. But also yeah. I mean, as you said, you put the ball in like a corner kick. You put the ball in the mixer and you get a head on it the right way, and boom, it's a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see that. I get why teams do it, but yeah, to have a keeper who can, take control of the box like that is really good.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, oh man, in the 38th minute, he had that save where he like dove across and he just got one hand on it and just like pushed it away. That was such a key moment where he really kept us in it then.
And actually, I really loved that save watching it. And, as someone who's playing keeper, you might be able to speak to this as well. But it really just looked to me very textbook in terms of making a save. He doesn't get out of position. He doesn't lose his footing. He's tracking the ball the whole way. I mean, you see the way he moves his feet. He's set. He's up. He's ready to move. And so when the shot comes in, and I heard some talk that it wasn't a particularly great shot. It wasn't a great shot, but from that angle, you say you back the man to score, but gets out, lays out, get a hand on it. It's just a real fantastic save.
Yeah, absolutely. So that save came in between our opening goal. I was pumped. Saka deflected. Well, actually, so this goal is one that I did want to talk to you about. So when they initially called the goal, they
Mm-hmm.
credited Saka with the goal, and then later on, it looks like it got reviewed and it got changed to an own goal on what was the player's name? Was it
It was Romero.
Romero? I knew it was a name started with R. I was going to say Ramirez. Yeah, Romero. It got credited as an own goal. How do you feel about that? From the angles that you saw, do you think that should be an own goal or a Saka goal?
No, it's an own goal. So there's something of a judgment call in this, but the idea of an own goal, what it suggests is if not for the deflection off of the defender, the ball would not be in the net.
Right.
Um, Sometimes you'll see that judgment call where there's a slight deflection and they'll say, yeah, but that shot was on target anyway. That probably goes in. This had such a dramatic bend. Like, it was almost at a right angle from where it was actually headed. It's such a dramatic bend.
So you think it would have gone clear of the far post?
Well, with Saka, I think he's capable from that distance. We've seen him curl it in, and if you had told me that he would have curled it in, it would have been an awesome goal, but I think it wouldn't have shocked me entirely if he had done that.
Yeah.
But of course you don't know that, but it's the ball's coming in at that angle and then it hits Romero and goes this way. So it's a massive change in direction. Would it have gone in without it? Maybe, but it's clear that it went in part because of the deflection it took off of him. So that's a classic own goal.
Yeah.
It's a judgment call is when I guess there's an official scorer who like makes that determination.
Yeah.
But that to me seemed like that, Yeah, it shouldn't have been Saka's goal. It was really always that. It was just a matter of time before they got that call right. I mean, yeah, it was an own goal,
Yeah.
and yeah, Christian Romero had a rough game, but we can talk about that later. More about that later.
Right. So yeah, so then it was in the 42nd minute that Son got really an unfortunate bounce off the inside corner of the post, and it went in, and they brought it even again, which was crushing right at the end, just as we were about into the safety of halftime, that he drew it even with us.
Yeah, but a lot of that. So before we get to the goal, I think I just feel to say, I don't know. How did you think we played overall in the first half? And we'll get you to sort of talk about what you saw.
Yeah, I mean, not great. I mean, it felt like we were kind of toothless in a lot of ways. Like we would kind of have the ball, but weren't really trying hard to get it in, I guess is my overall impression.
I mean, I thought we started fairly well. Tottenham controlled possession, but it was a lot. It reminded me a lot of when we played United, how they spent a good portion of the game passing it around their back line.
Mm-hmm.
And they were controlling possession, but we were sort of dictating the flow of the game. But I thought, Tottenham, I think, really grew into it, and I think I don't. I think we were very sloppy. That when we'd get possession, we'd get the ball, we very easily gave it away. Some of it was their
Right.
defending. Some of it was just, I think, the passing was off. We were a little sloppy in our touches. Um, and I think we had a game that could have easily. I shouldn't say it could have easily been a big lead for us, but I think if we had been a little bit more ruthless in the chances we had early on, we could have really put this one away. And instead, we let them hang around and really grow into the game. And then, frankly, that their goal there. I mean, Son is standing between three different defenders. That ball shouldn't get to him.
Mm-hmm.
If Saka loses, that was James Madison. He loses there on the touchline. That's just poor defending. That's a lot of poor, lazy defending, and we got punished for it.
Yeah.
And that kind of, as we sort of kept going throughout the game, I felt Tottenham grew into it, and for reasons we can get to as we get to the halftime and the substitutions that were made, I felt like we were losing our composure a little bit. We looked a little mentally tired, not so much physically tired, but very mentally tired, and I think that played into the overall performance.
Yeah, I could see that. So coming out of the half though, so we lost Declan Rice. Do you know what his status is?
He had apparently what I saw was he actually said to come out. He had said he tweaked his back or felt some pain in his back.
Oh,
Then
I
the
thought I
cat
heard
his
calf.
well, they said his calf was wrapped on the sideline, but
Okay.
it was his back that was hurting. Apparently, he asked to come off, which I mean, he's been so great for us, obviously, all season. So to lose him in the middle of the game, especially given he's, sort of a replacement for Thomas Partey, who is also out. So now we're down both of our defensive midfielders, which is, not great. Um, and so the way that's playing out is not ideal in that regard. Um, and he's replaced by Jorginho, who he's your third choice defensive midfielder. Obviously, ignoring we'll get to his involvement in their goal in a moment, but ignoring that, I mean, you lose a lot when you take him off the when you take Rice off the field and when you don't have Party, and that I think was something that we for some of the others we didn't talk about the other change in the early part of the game, which was that Leandro Trossard apparently picked up an injury. I think they said earlier that day in training, and so he was out. And so
Oh, okay. I
already
missed that.
Nketiah is now starting in the middle. You move Jesus out wide, and so you're already dealing with that. And then as players tired, and we started to make rotations and
Right.
substitutions, we're left with something of a really kind of more of a mishmash of a team than you might have expected there at the end of the game.
Hmm.
Um, from the sound of it, the injury for neither of them is particularly serious. We'll see. The expectation is that neither of them was going to play. Well, certainly Rice wasn't going to play against in the League Cup this week. I don't know. Maybe they were thinking about Trossard, but obviously the sense is he won't now.
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Obviously, long term, it sounds like we'll be okay, but in the moment, it was obviously a problem.
Right. That That all actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't been paying as close attention to the lineup and how that would affect things, but I could see that leading to
Mm,
some of the results that we saw.
yeah. But we did get a goal. It was Christian
Yeah.
Romero again. I told you he was having a bad day.
Yeah.
That's a handball. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what. I mean, look. I understand you need VAR. You need to look at it, but I mean, that was once it came up. I mean,
You see
there's
it the
no.
first time from any
Yeah.
angle that they possibly show it. His hand is away from his body. The ball comes
Yep.
up, it bounces down off the hand. They spent 2 to 3 minutes reviewing this, and I,
Yeah.
I don't
I
get
don't.
it.
I mean, if anything, the only thing I can think of is they were trying to decide whether or not it would count as a card for being what they call denial of an obvious goal scoring opportunity. You
Right.
notice they didn't give a card at all for that,
Right.
which I'm a little, it essentially saved a goal. You could give a red card for that.
Interesting.
Um, the famous one is it was in the World Cup in 20 I think it was 2010 in South Africa. Luis Suarez of Uruguay, well, still from Uruguay. This was at the end of extra time. The ball was coming in. He's a forward, by mind you, but he was back on defense to defend the game late. Punched the ball out of his own net, like saved a goal by doing that. Red card penalty.
Sure.
They were playing Ghana, then missed the penalty, and then they went to a shootout, and the Uruguayans prevailed in the shootout. And it's like, I mean, in some ways, it was the obvious form of gamesmanship, but in the end, it worked actually.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, you could argue that based on denying the goal or even a yellow. I think they probably looked and said it was inadvertent,
Right.
which okay.
Yeah, you can kind of see
I
it
mean,
either way.
I
Yeah.
mean, we get the important thing, of course, which is the penalty, and Saka
Yep.
buried it with a really nice penalty. Just buried it. I thought we did really well overall. They just did well with that. I heard some complaining. There was some weird frustration that you'll notice as soon as the ball hits his hand, like half the Arsenal team, basically anyone standing right around him, immediately goes,
Right. Yeah,
all
exactly.
sticking their
Yeah.
hands up in the air.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for maybe you all shouldn't be doing that because maybe you should be playing to the whistle necessarily. But I mean, I get it. It's a reaction. Players see that. So you see it all the time. Players see that, and obviously it worked out for us in the end.
Yeah, that's true. It's not quite as bad as a game or two ago when who was it? Thought that it was a foul and like picked the ball up and then got the handball called against him
Mm-hmm.
for doing that's not quite as bad
Yeah.
as that, but same league.
Right. Was that Trossard who did that? I think. Anyway,
Maybe I
yeah.
don't
It
remember
was
now.
right. Exactly. Yeah. You do play, as they say, you play to the whistle,
Right.
and you got to be careful. You got to be careful with that.
Yep. So yeah, so we're on cloud nine. We pulled back ahead toward the beginning of the second half. So now we put them on their back foot chasing for a whole minute. Yeah.
Yeah, Jorginho. And look, Jorginho's a good player. He's
Mm,
limited in some things, but he does a lot of things really well. He just got caught out there and got caught in a our the center backs were wide because they were presumably the ball was supposed to go further back towards Raya and then we were going to play it out of the back,
yeah.
but it left a lot of open space and Madison plays it to Son's not going to miss and it was
Yeah.
2-2 and it's frustrating because it feels like Arsenal really gets punished for those kind of mistakes, but that's you can't do that stuff at this level. And
No.
Spurs are Spurs. I think played beyond themselves a little bit. They have some decent players. I thought they did some things well overall. I don't think they were quite as. I don't think they're quite as good as their record indicates. That here they are at top of the league. Like I don't think they're going to do that. I think they've got
Yeah.
some other weaknesses, and they'll sort of get quote unquote exposed over time. But I thought that overall, I thought they played well. They really grew into the game, and then a player like Son, who is still a quality player, fought injuries last year. So I mean, in a sense, he was kind of down a bit.
Right.
We were certainly we were. I was a little surprised. And I think we were somewhat fortunate that when he got subbed off later in the game. I thought that was an interesting maneuver. Madison went off as well, and he's been excellent for them. But he was clearly hurt. Like he had that weird moment he twisted his knee. That was like I'm surprised he played as long as he did after
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
I wasn't surprised when Madison came off, but it was a little surprising to see Son as well. So I don't
Right.
know what the deal is with that. But obviously, he was on a hat trick, so I wasn't complaining about him coming off.
Yeah. So who do you think on Tottenham has kind of replaced? I'm blanking on his name. Who left now? What? I'm not
Harry
even
Kane,
joking.
you're thinking of
Harry Kane. I was
Harry
gonna say
Kane.
Harry Kane, but I didn't want to say the wrong name. That was the name
Yeah,
that I was thinking
that
of.
was the one. I don't think they've replaced him, and since you can't replace him, he really
Well,
is an
right,
excellent
but took his
striker.
place as kind of like the figurehead of the team, right? Like
Well,
the most notable player.
in a sense, they haven't. The big thing they've done really is they replaced the manager. So this guy they have, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of his name, Ange Postecoglou, I think is how it's pronounced. Um, he's Australian. Um, really an interesting guy. The last few managers they had, I mean, particularly they went through Antonio Conte and Jose Mourinho. Also had what's his name, Nuno Espirito Santo, another Portuguese manager. They had him for a while. Kind of dour, defensive-minded managers. I mean, Mourinho in particular is renowned by the teams he's not managing as a whiner, which he is. Conte definitely is a guy who complained about what he didn't have versus talking about what he did. And they generally played. We saw Tottenham last year, very defensive, sitting back on the block, looking to break us on the counter. They had Son, they had Kane, they could do that, effectively. But sort of selling Kane and then bringing Postecoglou, who wants a sort of a more open form of the game. I was a little surprised at how effective they were at really taking the game to us. I mean, our midfield was a wreck. We were getting bypassed throughout the midfield, especially in the second half. We were, in some analysis, we're frankly lucky to get a draw out of this one.
Hmm.
Because they were very dangerous at various points. But that sort of more attacking style, I get it. It's a little more fun to watch, certainly for the fans, but also for neutrals. Um, in a sense, they haven't replaced Kane in the sense that they have another talismanic player. I guess you could say Son, but he was always been a big name for them.
Hmm.
Really, what they've done is now sort of spread that burden out. And so by moving the ball a little more, you're not funneling everything into the one player. So they're sort
Yeah.
of changing the way they're structured, or the way they move things around. Also, I'm really the big one is bringing in Madison, who's been outstanding for them so far this season. He's a good player. He's a guy Arsenal was looking at, I believe, last year. We talked about there was some interest in him last summer that never really went any further than that. But he's a good player, and he's having been removed from the deteriorating or the sinking ship that was Leicester, has really sort of come into his own a little bit more now as a player at what is a club that has real pretensions towards a European spot. So
Right. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that he came from Leicester because I knew I remember the name because how can you forget James Madison, like one of our
mhm.
founding fathers? But I forgot that he was playing for Leicester last season. So, okay.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, he was at Leicester. He was one of those guys who, when they went down, I mean, he's a player that they had been thinking about selling. That other teams were looking at him, including Arsenal, and so that he was available when they went down. Spurs signed him, and there he is. And
Right.
yeah. Again, he's made the adjustment. He's doing really well for Spurs at this point.
Yeah. So, any closing thoughts on the Tottenham match, or do you want to go to? I was thinking maybe we'd do Player of the Week instead of Player of the Match since we had two matches.
Mm, um. Not really. I hate dropping points at home to them,
Mm-hmm.
especially with the
Yeah.
rivalry
Doesn't
angle.
feel good.
It felt like we were going to have to learn to manage ourselves. This was their third game in 8 days, and Everton had a certain emotion attached to it. The Champions League had a certain emotion attached to it. The North London Derby has a certain emotion attached to that, and we really have to learn to sort of manage those kind of ebbs and flows, and not allow ourselves, yeah, because there's going to be a sense of fatigue there, and we sort of have to allow ourselves not to get caught up in that. But it'd also be curious to see what Arteta does in terms of lineups. I mean, the injuries are really kind of getting to us. I mean, Rice and Trossard probably aren't out for very long. Martinelli, I said, is probably coming back hopefully soon. They're talking about hoping to have Thomas Partey back for the City game in mid October, so in a couple weeks. So hopefully we
Okay.
start to get some of these guys back. But in the moment, it's kind of destabilizing us, especially because you're seeing where those injuries are coming. Right now, we lose both of our central defensive midfielders. So now we're on Jorginho, our third string guy. We lose Trossard. Jesus still can't go 90 minutes. Yeah, that's partly why we saw him Reese Nelson come on for him.
Right.
So you look at the lineup we had there at the end of the game. Those are not the guys you want trying to close out a game like this.
Yeah.
Um, which is how it goes sometimes. It's just the hope is that the injuries are small or not terribly long lasting, and that these guys are able to come back.
Yeah. Okay. Who is your pick for player of the week across these two matches?
I mean, this it hurts a little bit, and because so many guys were so poor, I think in the Tottenham game, including even Raya for that matter. Some of his distribution was really poor. His long kicks, weren't that was generally another one of his strengths. I mean, he had the good save, but he also had a few other balls that I was like, it isn't quite. I don't think that's what you wanted to do there. Again, I'm not calling for him to be benched or anything like that, but I thought he struggled at times. Didn't have a lot to do against PSV. I think for the PSV game, I think you could say probably I would go with Saka, Jesus, or Odegaard. For this Tottenham game, I think you have to look more to the defenders. I thought Saliba in particular, but he and Gabriel together, I think did a very good job of sort of preventing the Spurs' opportunities from becoming worse. I saw a lot of the passing on the offensive end, even from Odegaard, Saka, Rice, Zinchenko. So a lot of the passing and overlapping didn't quite work the way it typically did. Some of that, I was reading something, there might be some tactical shifts. I guess it's a long way of saying I don't really know. Tell you what, I'll say Ben White. I thought White was able to get himself in some dangerous positions against Tottenham. I thought he did some. I thought he was part of that lineup that was just rolling against PSV. So I guess if I pick one guy who, Saliba and Gabriel were great in Europe, but didn't have to do as much. So I'm gonna throw it to Ben White, who's just very quietly a really good player.
Yeah, I can see that. For me, I mean, you can probably tell from how I've been talking throughout this episode so far. But yeah, I'm really impressed by Raya. I can see some of the mistakes you were referring to
Mm-hmm.
in this match, especially. But I'm impressed with his style. I'm excited to see him more, and I love Ramsdale. Nothing against Ramsdale, but I am excited to see how things go as Raya continues to play. So.
Yeah. I think Raya's
Um,
a good shout. I just look at him and say he didn't really have much to do in the PSV game or the
right.
Everton game for that matter. And then what I saw against Spurs, yeah, he did some good things handling the cross as well. I thought his distribution was not particularly great. He kicked a couple balls straight out of bounds, which was
Yeah.
not what you want to do.
No.
I mean, again, I don't want to pick on the guy. A lot of Arsenal players were poor. I thought Odegaard didn't have a great game. Saka was good for parts of it. Jesus was good for parts of it, but
Yeah. One question is just kind of a more minor question, but this was from the PSV match. So a couple of names that sounded familiar to me. I just wanted you to remind me, do I know these names from World Cup they played for their national teams, or was this from when we played PSV in the group stage in the Europa League? So De Jong and Dest.
You certainly remember them probably from I'll tell you what, Serginho Dest you definitely remember from the World Cup because he plays for the U.S. national team.
Okay.
There's actually a couple of Americans on PSV. There's Ricardo Pepi, striker who didn't play. I don't believe played in the Champions League game. Malik Tillman is a reserve midfielder for them. He has played. He's gotten a couple caps with the U.S., including I think had one just in the last window in September. Actually, also for the U.S., their director of football, so one of their management figures, is a guy named Ernie Stewart, who, though he was born in the Netherlands, was actually a longtime player for the U.S. national team.
Hmm.
And actually was very recently. Yeah, he played 100 games with the 101 games with the U.S.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm looking at some now. His dad was in the Air Force, and his mom was Dutch, and so he grew up in the
Ah.
Netherlands. But through his father, was American as far as the international game is concerned.
Right.
So there's definitely an American flavor to PSV to some extent. As far as Luke De Jong, he did play for the Dutch national team in the World Cup. Although when I hear De Jong, the bigger name is Frankie De Jong, who I believe is at Barcelona. Is an excellent young Dutch player. I think he's still at Barcelona. But maybe you are thinking of Luke de Jong. I don't know.
I mean, if you played, I did definitely watch a few of the Netherlands World Cup matches as they progressed through once the U.S. was eliminated.
mhm.
So that probably is it then. So cool.
Yeah. So yes, those are recognizable names.
All right. Well, tell me what's coming up for next week and maybe slightly beyond.
Right. So the games are coming fast and furious now. We talked about the energy level. Two games this week. Third round on Wednesday. We're going to play the third round of the Carabao Cup. So expect to see a heavily rotated lineup. We're going to be at Brentford, which will be a really interesting game. We'll see what happens. I don't know. I really have no idea what we're going to line up. I don't know what Brentford's going to line up as too. They may not take this particularly seriously either. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Saturday, back to the league. We go to Bournemouth. So we're going to play at the Cherries on Saturday. And then next Tuesday, because we don't usually post this till later in the week, but before we record next time, after we record next time,
before we post it.
Before we post, there we go. Tuesday at Lens or Lens. I don't know how you say it. It's French. The French team in our group in the Champions League. That'll be Tuesday, Champions League group stage game number 2.
Sure.
So busy week upcoming.
And I'm sure we can count on the commentators during the match to help us find the right way to pronounce a name. I'm sure that'll get it all straightened out.
You have much more faith in them than I do. But anyway,
that was sarcasm. It's
yeah,
funny. My son tried sarcasm for the first time today, and it didn't go very well. All right.
And by the way, I do want to add lurking really quickly right after the Lens game on October 7th is Manchester City. So
oh boy, it's coming.
Yes.
All right. Thanks for joining us at Gooner U. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and some other places, and we appreciate you subscribing to our show and sharing it with friends. If you're watching on YouTube, and we certainly recommend you do, please like and subscribe. To support the show even more, you can become a Gooner U superfan for ad-free episodes, as well as raw, unedited bootleg recordings available the night we record. It's only $1 a month, and there's a link in the show notes to join. You can follow our show on Twitter at Gooner U Show for updates and to ask questions. Again, my name is Dove, and you can find me on Twitter at Dove Frankel. With me, as always, is Keith, and you can find him in a pub watching Arsenal matches.
Come on, you Gunners.